Hello developers, welcome back to your channel TapaScript where you learn things fundamentally and conceptually. Without data, your application will be merely a blank application, isn't it? So when you have to deal with data, you have to deal with data fetching. Today's video, I am going to take you in depth about data fetching in React application and then going to talk about what is the right way of doing things. There are multiple ways you can deal with data in React applications, and we know from several resources of how to do that, how to use it. But today's video about the questions of why is not much about the how. We want to ask the question why I have to use a certain approach over another one, and what is the best approach that React provides us to do data fetching in much more optimal way. One request, as you are going through this video, please take notes and do practice. All the source code that you'll be seeing in this video already in the description of it, so just go fetch it out, clone it, and start looking into them. Without any further delay, let us get started with the topic of today. The focus of today's video is about React Suspense. I'm sure you heard about this term a lot. Actually, React Suspense is existing in React since React 16, but it was was under the carpet. Since React 18, it came into a superpower, and then the developer community started realizing its whole potential. Today we are going to talk about React Suspense, but before that, as we are speaking about data fetching, I want to clarify a few concepts, the concepts of client and server. So if you're very new to data fetching, you will have to know that there is something called client and there is something called server. So client makes a request to the server, and then server actually serve that request as a response to the client. So client makes a request, server serve as a response, client makes a request, server serve as a response. That's how, at a very high level, how data fetching takes place from the client and server. The client can be any of your handheld devices, your browser or anything. Server can be something on the cloud or a physical machine, anything, right? In that matter. As you know about the client and server thing, before we even step into Suspense, we have to realize what are the different ways that you as a React developer can deal with data fetching. I'm going to talk about 3 ways, okay? Now the first way that I'm going to talk about, the first pattern is called fetch on render. So it means you fetch your data on your component rendering. You fetch your data on your component rendering. This is probably the majority of the React developers have been doing since ages. Since React is there, since React started giving functional components or the class component, from that ages also, people are just doing this. They're fetching the data on component render. We're going to see what it is visually and with the code. The second approach is about fetch, then render. So fetch on render has its some kind of drawback. So then the other pattern that came is first you fetch the data and then you render your component. So fetch, then render. And the third aspect that we are going to learn today is called render while fetch. It means you render your component while you are fetching the data. The name itself, the paradigm itself sounds like this is a best approach, because for the first approach, you are fetching the data while you are rendering your component. There might be some kind of problem. Second is you first fetch, then you render. So render probably have to wait for the fetching. The third approach, you are rendering. You are giving priority of your rendering while you are fetching the data. Sounds like a great approach, isn't it? So let's look into this approach one by one. The first approach is about fetch on render. So how does it work? Let's see first visually, then we'll get into the code. Let's assume this is your application, and in your application there is a component. Okay. Now your component is there, which has to extract data from some server. So there is a server there, over there, maybe on cloud. Now your component makes a request. And once it makes a request, it's making the request while it is rendering. Okay, so this is what you have to keep in mind. Fetch on render. It is fetching the data while rendering. So it means its rendering gets halted until the response comes back. Once the response is back, the rendering actually happens. So until the response is back, you are actually holding off your rendering on this with this strategy, like fetch on render strategy. Now there is a problem. The problem is think about a case where you have a child component, over here. Now the child component is also making a network call. The child component is also making an asynchronous call. So in that case, the child component's rendering part itself won't come at all until the parent component's request response finishes. So first parent component's request happen, the response come, the parent component renders, then the child component comes into picture. then its calls is request happen, then its response happen. So it means that child component's request response is halted until the parent's component's request response is complete. This particular phenomena is already have a name called network waterfall, which is really bad and dangerous for an application of today's in the modern application. So this is fetch on render. How about the code? I told you this is the kind of fetch on render code that we all React developers have been writing since ages. Let's see how this code look like. Here goes a component which is going to demonstrate the fetch on render strategy. What is this component about? Is about a component which makes a network call on this particular URL and fetch data about various countries and show the name of all the countries onto browser. This is pretty simple use case. So for that, what we are doing things like we are having a state call data, right, which is going to fetch all the country stuff and handling. We also have a state call set time, but we are really not using it in this example. We'll be using it in the next example, but so ignore this one. And we have another state call is loading. And I'm sure that you have been using is loading a lot. This is to track if the particular request has been completed and we got the response back or an error back so that we can handle it. So it's initialized with true. And then we have a use effect that runs only on the first time because we have given this as an empty array as a dependency. So when the component mounts, that time this particular effect will run. So what this effect will run, it will set the loading indicator as true. Then it will make the call, the async call. Once the async call completes, it set the state and making this is loading as false. That means the loading is complete. If I look into our JSX part once quick, what I'll see is like if it is this loading, then I'm returning like loading countries and time, some kind of indicators, fair enough. And I'm only returning, okay, from my JSX if the is loading is true. In case is loading is false, it means my request response is done. Then I am actually passing all the country information into another component, child component called country list. Country list is a very, presentational component which takes the data, extract the name out of it, and show the common name of that particular country. Very straightforward application. But there are few things. But before I go there, let me try to run this application for you. Okay? For a very fraction of second, the loading indicator would have come. You would have missed it, seeing it, but it has come. And then we got this particular data. This is probably the browser cache. That's why you are not able to see the loading indicator very fast. But if it is like for the first time I'm doing, I'm doing in incognito mode, I'll be able to see the loading indicator pretty well. Okay. So now this is good. This is showing all the country information, everything works. But there are few things that we need to note down. One thing is the loading indicator that we use here, React doesn't know it is a loading indicator. Have you ever realized that this is loading? You can name anything. You can name A, B, C, D, Tapas, Tapascript, JavaScript, anything you can name actually. We are actually maintaining a state by ourselves and tracking this loading indicator for our own usage. React is not doing it for you. Okay. Second thing is like we have to manage an effect, and we are managing this effect on mounting of this component. So it means that unless this is done, your component is not going to render at all. So your component rendering is actually halted due to this fetching approach. Now this approach was not bad at all because this is how React started it and many of us have used it. But these are the shortcomings that we have. You have to explicitly track your loading state. Second thing is like what you are doing is basically you are halting the rendering of your component because you are fetching the data. Right? That also you are doing it forcefully by yourself using the use effect. And you also have to manage additional state for the data and etc. I hope you got this thing. And one of the major drawback I told that if this component has a child component, like I have a child component called time, which is making another network call to get the current time of a particular country, that particular network call will be halted unless this particular use effect run and the rendering of the country's component happens. So it is also going to create a network waterfall. I hope that is clear. Now we are going to go to our next strategy, the next pattern that we opt for fetching data in React application. The next strategy is about fetch, then render. So what happened in this case? Again, I have an application, and in that application, I have a component. But instead, component is making a call to your server and fetching the details before the component, above the component in the application itself, somewhere in the application itself. What we do, we try to fetch the data. So we make a request and then you get a response. Once we get the data, then we push the data into component, and then component re-renders, and then everything else takes place. Fine. So in this case, we actually, what we did, we tried to solve the problem of network waterfall. We tried to lift all the data fetching aspects of it, above the component, so that whenever the component renders, it has all the data along with it. But we introduce one more problem. What is that? Let's say that fetch data is fetching multiple data from the multiple sources. So it means that it is making multiple asynchronous call. Now, if it is making say 2 or 3 asynchronous call, the slowest call that completes is always win. It means that the fetch data really has to wait until the slowest network call completes. So your rendering, basically your component rendering, also has to wait until the slowest network call completes. So the slowest one wins. Now, have you used this in your application yet? If you have not, it's fine. But I want to show you like how you can do fetch and then do a render. Okay, so let's look into the code again. In this code, what we are doing, we are fetching two details, actually making two different calls. One is about fetching the countries as we have done before. And second thing is about fetching the time. This is making this API call. This is making another API call. And then we are returning the country's information, we're returning the time information. Fair enough. And then we have one more function where we are executing fetch countries. If you see, it's an async call, it's an async function. So you have to use the await keywords. If you're new to async and await, there is a video already that you can check out. And then you get the country's information. Similarly, I get the time information. So I've executed both the calls here. And then I'm actually returning both the calls in an array, right? You can do in several different ways, but I'm returning an array. So this data array will have the information about all the countries that it has fetched and the time, that information that it has fetched. But notice one thing, all these things happen fairly outside of our countries component. We are not making any of this call. We are not executing the countries call or the time call in the use effect of countries. Rather, after all the executions, we are just returning the value, and this value we are using in our use effect. That's the only thing we are doing. Okay, so we are using our value all data in our use effect. From there we are extracting the first data, which is like country, and second is the time. And then usually we do a loading indicator again as true, and then loading indicator as false. Okay, and the JSX remain almost same with the previous example. If it is loading, show some kind of loading indicator like loading countries and time. And the second thing is about, I am showing two components now. One is time with the time data, and the country list component is as usual that we have used before. So this code is pretty simple. The difference, against the previous one is like, instead of on render is not happening here, it is first fetching at the outside of the component, and then it is doing the rendering. Okay, so in this case, possibly the network waterfall problem is reduced. But if you have noticed, like in case this data actually going to take a longer time to fetch you, but the time is coming very fast, still your component has to wait for rendering time until the data comes up, right? Because you are actually fetching everything upfront, and then you are pushing everything into your component for rendering. So one component rendering has to wait because its data is delayed by the other component. Okay, so let me run this right now and see what is the output. I'm going to see a time first and then the country list. Here you go. So you saw an indicator for a few milliseconds, and then you have the time, and then you have the country list. So you understood this strategy also, that fetch and then render. Now we are going to see our third strategy. That is where I'm going to introduce you to Suspense. I'm going to talk about like how Suspense is going to mitigate some of the problems that we're facing over here. Okay, so let's see that. So with both the approaches so far, we are actually running with a few headaches. What are those? One headache is, of course, we have to maintain a loading state, and the state by ourselves. It is not something that React gives. We ourselves maintain it. Second is the data fetching as an effect. So you have to maintain a side effect. So it means that your component is not a pure component. So if you are new to pure component, pure functions, and you want to know like why a component is pure component, and that's a good way of dealing with it, I have a video about the pure function and side effect. Just go and look into it. And then the third thing is about React doesn't know we are making an async call and how we are dealing with that particular async call. React probably knows that we are making an async call, but React doesn't know how we are dealing with this async call. It's completely us which we are doing it. And that brings me to a topic of React Suspense. And before we get into React Suspense, I want you to understand one is called imperative, one is called declarative. In the initial days of this React playlist, I explained what is imperative and declarative means and what are the difference between them. Let me quickly catch up with what is imperative and declarative. In imperative programming, you tell exactly what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So you yourself as a programmer detail out everything, what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. In declarative programming, you tell the program what needs to be done in a declarative way. We know, like in a descriptive way, program takes care of it, and it actually has its own level of abstraction and it does it for you. React by itself is a declarative programming because you don't do a lot of DOM manipulation by yourself. React does it for you. The examples that we have seen where we were handling the loading state, we were handling the effect and everything is more about imperative way of doing it. So in the imperative way, we are managing the loading state. We are telling that we need a loading indicator. We are also telling like how to manage this loading indicator using the loading state that we are creating as a developer. We are not leaving it to React to handle this one. How good it would be, right, if we can actually leave it to React completely in a declarative way, and we say, hey React, whenever the asynchronous call is happening, you automatically pick it up that if the call is complete or not. If the call is not complete, it means that if it is pending, you show this loading indicator, this particular UI, and once the call is completed, automatically replace the loading indicator with the data that you are fetching. That's the declarative way. Here you are not managing any state by yourself for loading. You are not doing all those if else condition by yourself. You are telling React to take care of it. That's what React Suspense is for. That's what React Suspense gives you the power to make the asynchronous call and handle the asynchronous call states declaratively in React programming. How? Let's see visually first, then with the code. This is where we are talking about render while fetch and using the suspense. So it is not fetch on render, it is not fetch then render, it is render while you fetch. Okay, so how does it happen? Again, we have an application, and in the application we have a component. Okay, now React provide you a special component called suspense, SUSP and what React expect you to do, if your component is making any asynchronous call, you have to wrap that component with that suspense component. Okay, you have to wrap that component with the suspense component. And then after, if your component is making any request, until the request complete, the suspense will make sure that it is going to show any loading indicator that you think that is suitable for you. It can be a simple string like loading something. It can be some kind of shimmer effect. It can be anything that of your choice. It's your component that suspense will make sure it is going to bring it into picture. It is going to render until the call is complete. Once the call is complete, suspense will again make sure that it takes out this loading indicator and it is bring back your component with the data that you have fetched. This is great, isn't it? The power over here is like you are really not managing any loading state by yourself. You are not doing all those if else call by yourself. It is React that is going to do everything for you. Do you want to see how the code works? But before that, see the advantages. These are the things before suspense we had. We used to maintain loading state, data fetching as an effect. React didn't know when the asynchronous call is happening, like how your state is really going to get engaged with it. You yourself were doing, but all this thing is gone right now. With suspense, what we have, very simple, we tell React what to do when a component is pending on an asynchronous call. React takes care of everything else for you. Now we are going to see in the code like how the suspense thing work. I'm going to explain to you. Here is the modified code using suspense. I told React gives us a special component called suspense. So we have imported suspense. And then any of your component that makes an asynchronous call, you have to wrap that component using this suspense component. So here we have two components, time and country list. Now, instead of fetching all the details of countries and time before the component, we are going to fetch the individual details of time and the country in this individual respective components. We're going to see that in a while. But assume that time component will make an asynchronous call, and fetch the time data and render itself. The country list component is also going to make an asynchronous call, get the countries data and going to render itself. Now both these components are making asynchronous call, and so why I'm wrapping these components individually using the suspense component. Now using the suspense component, you also get an advantage. You get an attribute called fallback. The fallback attribute can be assigned with any React component. It can be an inline React component, or you have created a React component somewhere, import it and use it. Is up to you completely. This fallback, whatever you assigned with, that will be rendered until the call for this particular asynchronous call for this particular component is done and the component is rendered. Okay, so this is the advantage where you are seeing here, I don't have any loading indicator. I'm not managing any loading indicator state at all. I don't have any use effect also. I don't have anything. What I'm doing, I'm telling React, hey React, I have a component time which makes an asynchronous call. Unless the asynchronous call is complete, please show a message called loading time. I could have used another React component here that shows a beautiful loading indicator or a shimmer effect or anything. Same thing I'm doing for the country list as well. Now, what React is going to do? React is going to show this loading time and loading countries until these calls are complete. So if the time call comes first, this is the advantage. If the time call comes back first with its response, the loading time will go off and we'll see the time. If this is what is going to take more time, let it take more time. That is not going to block the time component to render, which we had a problem in the earlier approaches, isn't it? So here we don't have any network waterfall. We don't have any such condition where the slowest call win. Here we have kind of made things quite independent. We are not having any loading state to manage. We are not having any effect to manage. Things are pretty smooth and pretty simple. Okay. But before I show the demo of it, let's go and see like how am I handling the asynchronous call for time and country list. I told there is no state management, no use effect. So how am I handling this one? Let's go ahead and see the country list. So I'm in the country list over here. Okay. What country list is doing? It is actually making an asynchronous call, is doing a fetch data call. And this asynchronous call is giving me the response. I am reading the response over here, and after reading the response, I am getting all the countries details, and then I am mapping through and I am listing out all the country names. Very simple, isn't it? Very, very simple thing. You might have a question, what is this fetch data is about? What is this read method is about? We'll get there. Just give a minute. But before that, let us see also time. So what is the time component? Same, a time component is making another call, another asynchronous call, getting the response, reading the response from this one, get the time and showing the date and time. Fantastic, very well. Now at this point, let us see what is the output. Then we'll talk about this fetch data, where I'll introduce you to another concept called suspender. So suspender comes with suspense in React. People talk about React suspense a lot, but they don't talk about suspender a lot. You have to understand what suspender is as well. In interviews, people might ask these questions. I'll get into the suspender in a while, but first let me show you the output of it. All right, let me run this. Okay, again, I have the time and I have also the countries. If I had given some delay, you would have noticed that there is a loading time, loading countries were coming separately. Okay, so two separate loading state, two separate loading indicators internally being handled by Suspense. All right, so the next thing that we are going to talk about is this fetch data part. This is where we are talking about the suspender as well. So fetch data is an implementation that is open to everyone, every library, every framework to take care of. So in my case, the fetch data is nothing but it is a simple promise that it returns. It actually does a fetch call. If I go inside, it actually does a fetch call, and after fetch call, it wrap up promise and it just return the promise. This is my own implementation. This is my own implementation that if I pass an URL, it is going to fetch the data from it, return a promise, and I wrap that promise, so that I can actually manage the state of that particular promise, like whether the promise is pending or it is fulfilled. I can actually manage those state, and then I return the value appropriately. This is my implementation. Now Next.js would have implemented this in completely its own way. Something else would have implemented it completely in different way. So how you are going to implement your suspender, the way that you deal with your data fetching, is completely up to the provider. So I have implemented this way my suspender. I just created a wrapper. Any URL you pass, it is just going to return you a promise, and then I'm wrapping the promise to return you back the state of that promise and whether there is an error data or there is a successful response of it. That's it. Now this fetch data part can be implemented completely different way by a framework. It can be more complex where they can manage cache, they can manage different aspects of a network call. For this particular demonstration sake, it's a very simple component. It's also available over internet. You can see like in many blogs or many videos, people use this, wrapper promises. This is a very simple demonstration example that is available. So similar to that, I'm using one. And then after using that, I'm able to read the response from the call that I'm giving. And then I'm actually fetching the details. One simple alteration for this fetch data could be, instead of fetch, you can use Axios. So Axios is another library for making the asynchronous call, right? You can use Axios. That will be another implementation for your suspender. So suspender actually where it suspends for your network call, and then the suspense, what it does is basically it sees underneath the component is making a network call, and based on its state, automatically it's going to show you the fallback loading indicator. And then once the loading is done, you got a success or failure. The loading will be replaced with your component along with the success or failure data based on how you handle that. Go ahead and look into this code in more details. It is there in the description of this video. I'm sure that is going to like it. But we are not done yet. I'm going to show you something called error boundary, which is another important concept. Like if you are making an asynchronous call, it is also possible that you are getting an error back instead of always get the proper response back. Now, along with suspense, how are you going to handle this particular error in your code? Let's see with error boundary, but first again visually and then with code. Let's talk about error boundary quickly. Okay, so what is error boundary? Again, we have an application, we have a component, we wrap the component using suspense because our component is making an asynchronous call. But what happens when this asynchronous call fails? It results into an error. How do we handle this error? So React also have something called error boundary, and around this error boundary there are various implementation already available. You can create an error boundary yourself using higher order component or class components or whatever ways. Also there are existing React based libraries, npms, that gives you the ready-made error boundary to work with. So in our example we'll be using one of those library, and then it'll be showing like how error boundary is being handled. So what is error boundary is like around suspense, you can create a boundary. This boundary works in a way like if your suspense, indicates that there is an error of this asynchronous call that your component is making, it will reach out to its nearest possible error boundary and give that error boundary to handle this error. Suspense handles your loading and the successful response with the component. But what if there is an error? There is a more elegant way that you can actually handle the error, so that suspense will give that error part to its nearest error boundary, and that is where you can actually provide a custom UI for that particular error, a custom message, maybe a custom 404, some emojis, whatever you want. So more elegant way that you can improve the UX of your application, the user experience of your application. So in this case, what happens? Let's see. So I have a survey again. Your component is actually making the asynchronous call. Now while asynchronous call is pending, you have the loading indicator by suspense, but let's say this asynchronous call result into an error. So loading indicator goes off, now it goes to error boundary, and error boundary is showing this particular error UI to your user. That's how it works visually. Visually done, let's see it through the coding. It's very simple. I'm going to show you. And this is where we are going to see about error boundary. So you are seeing at the top of this page, I'm importing something called error boundary from React error boundary npm. Either using npm install or yarn add, you can actually add this dependency and then import error boundary over here. Now, once you're done importing error boundary, the code that you see is exactly same as the previous code that we have seen, where we have this time component which is making an asynchronous call wrapped by suspense and its fallback loading indicator, and then same for the country list, but we are now wrapping the suspense using something called an error boundary, and also giving a fallback to the error boundary, which is nothing but if there is an error happen, what to show. Again, over here, you can show an inline component, inline message, or you can create a better looking, better UX error message page, component, whatever it is, and then can actually show that in the fallback. So it means now if any of this call fails, I'm going to see something called something went wrong. Do you want to see that? Let's see that. Now to make this error happen, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into one of this particular component, like country list is making this particular call. I'll change this URL to something invalid. I just remove that one L, so it's an invalid URL. I'll just save this one, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring my browser back, and I'm trying this URL. Let's see what happened. Do you see what happened? Loading indicator came for a while, and then you saw something went wrong. It directly went into the error message. Okay, it directly went into the error message. But there is a problem. What is the problem is the country list has failed, but the time would have got successful. But in this case, I am not able to show the time also because the error boundary is wrapping both time and country list suspense. Now you can logically group your suspense and error boundary. I told that the suspense will reach out to its nearest error boundary. So it means if I just cut this particular portion of the code and paste it around the country list suspense alone. So what I'm saying is, like, I am not interested in managing any error for time, or I can have another error boundary around the suspense with a different kind of message. And in this case, I'm saying that error boundary having a fallback if the country list some problem happen. Let me customize this. Something went wrong in fetching countries. Okay, I have just customized this particular message as well. Now what will happen if I just go and run this code? Do you see that what happened? If I run this code, my loading time came, loading countries came, the time got loaded successfully because there is no problem with the time call at all. But the countries didn't load, and for that the error is coming like something went wrong in fetching countries. So now I am not only handling my asynchronous call more elegantly, not only handling the loading part of it more elegantly, I'm also handling the error more elegantly. Now you can go as much as possible more creative way to create an error message, creating the loading indicator, separate it out for your different components that are making asynchronous call, separate it out for the loading indicators for them, for their error messages, and the life is more beautiful. The user experience of your application is really, really uplifted than the previous two approaches we spoke, where we did fetch on render, halting the rendering, fetch then render. Again, the rendering is getting halted. Here you are rendering while fetching, which is a biggest improvement that we have got. Now this concept is very important if you are getting into Next.js. Next.js, if you're getting into the latest version of Next.js with the Next.js app router, this concept is pretty important, where in the layout, in the pages, we'll be seeing the usage of suspense, left and right. So we'll be seeing like how Next.js handle error, loading, and we'll be able to understand Next.js as a framework underlying using some of these concepts, very beautifully. With that, I want to announce that we'll be starting a Next.js series very soon. So if you're watching this video, stay tuned for the Next.js series, where we'll be teaching you Next.js app router with many smaller videos end to end. Okay. So with that, I hope this concept is clear. You know why suspense used, you know why error boundary is there, you know about React data fetching, and you have multiple ways of doing data fetching in React instead of knowing how to do in each of this approach. Now you ask the question why I should use one above another, and you very well know like which one is the optimal way of using it. So friends, one important concept done. Please practice, please look into the code that we have shown in this video and try to practice around that. The link is in the description of this video. Also, I have mentioned about a few videos. I have also posted the link of them in the description. Please go ahead and check it. Up next, I'm going to focus more about Next.js and want to teach more about Next.js, but some of these fundamental concepts are very, very important before you get started with Next.js. So stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to this channel because it gives me a lot of motivation to teach you better. Thank you. See you soon.